What most of us are interested in is how MDMA impacts the brain. And so I'm going to spell out the three major ways in which MDMA changes the activation of the brain in the short and long term. And here I'm pooling across a number of different studies. But one of the key sets of studies in this area comes from what I consider very beautiful work of Harriet DeWitt. Harriet DeWitt runs the Human Behavioral Pharmacology Laboratory in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neuroscience at the University of Chicago. And her laboratory has a long history of giving people certain drugs in very specific dosages and then measuring their effects on the brain using different types of imaging, including fMRI. And one particular study that I'll highlight is entitled Effects of MDMA on Sociability and Neural Responses to Social Threat and Social Reward. So what this study looked at is how MDMA impacts people's perceptions of others' emotional expressions on their face. What they found is that when people are on MDMA, their response to threatening faces or other threatening stimuli is reduced. And it's reduced in a very specific way, which is reductions in activity of the amygdala. The amygdala is a structure that some of you may be familiar with. It is known to be involved in the threat detection systems or networks of the brain. It is sometimes called the fear area of the brain, although I want to caution people against assigning any one particular subjective experience to any one particular brain area. The amygdala is actually a complex. It's actually called the amygdaloid complex and has a lot of different sub areas, and it's involved in a lot of things besides fear and threat detection. Nonetheless, when people are under the influence of MDMA, and you show them a face that is grimacing or would otherwise be rated as quite threatening, they tend to rate it as less threatening. In addition, they tend to respond to happy faces or even slightly happy faces as more kind or more generous or happier than they would when they are not on MDMA. Again, the faces that are being shown are not of people on MDMA. That would be an interesting experiment, but that's not what they did here. What's happening here is people are being given MDMA and then they are rating in a subjective way the friendliness or the level of threat that they detect in these facial expressions. And of course, they have extremes of friendly and threatening, but then they also grade them, right? They titrate them so that they also have mildly threatening and mildly happy faces, etc. So everything from a grin to a smirk to a giant smile, everything from a sort of somebody looking a little bit askance at somebody to really, wide-eyed and looking angry like they're, going to attack you and things of that sort. So what's discovered in the study is that MDMA has a bidirectional effect on our perception of others' emotions, making people more likely to rate something as positive if it's initially positive or even a little bit positive, and less likely to rate a threatening face as more threatening. Now, one thing I have not mentioned thus far are the dosages of MDMA used in this and in other studies. And fortunately, despite the studies that we're going to talk about using a lot of different types of people, different ages, different sexes, so male and female, located in different parts of the world even, some with PTSD, some not with PTSD, etc., there's been fairly tight dosage control of MDMA in these studies. It's not perfectly matched from study to study, but it's pretty darn close, which makes interpreting results across studies a lot easier for me and therefore for you. The typical dosages of MDMA used in these neuroimaging studies and in the clinical studies of PTSD that we're going to talk about later range anywhere from 0.75 milligrams per kilogram of body weight to 1.5 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. So for somebody like me, I weigh 220 pounds, that's 100 milligrams. 1.5 milligrams per kilogram of body weight would therefore be 150 milligrams in a single dose. Okay. A dosage of 1 milligram per kilogram of body weight would mean 100 milligrams for my 100 kilograms. Okay. Somebody lighter than 100 kilograms would obviously take less MDMA in one of these studies. But in general, the range of MDMA that's been explored is 0.75 to 1.5 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. The exception being, in the clinical studies that we'll talk about a little bit later, there's a tendency to explore both an initial dose of 1.5 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. So again, a 100 kilogram person, that would be 150 milligrams or so, and then a so-called booster of half that amount, about 90 minutes to 2.5 hours into the session. So in other another 75 milligrams later. And I should point out that there is not always the inclusion of the so-called booster, and in some cases, lower doses of MDMA, such as the 0.75 milligrams per kilogram dosages, are used. Why am I getting so into the details of dosages? Well, if we are going to talk about toxicity of MDMA, we absolutely have to talk about dosages, because like any drug, the toxicity of MDMA does scale with the dosage that's applied, not just the frequency of MDMA use. We hear a lot about that. Someone has taken MDMA 1 time or 4 times or 200 times. We hear about frequency of use, but rarely do we hear about the specific dosages that are taken in any one particular session. So when we talk about the subjective effects or the brain networks that are activated when people take MDMA, in general, we're talking about dosages somewhere between 0.75 milligrams per kilogram of body weight and 1.5 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. Although typically you're going to see studies, both clinical and more research explorative, using anywhere from 1 to 1.5 milligrams of MDMA per kilogram of body weight. So that's important to highlight.